This is an historic moment. We have before us the opportunity to forge for ourselves and for future generations a new world order.
The perfect money is that medium of exchange which everybody is willing to accept. So one of the things that makes gold and silver particularly good as money is because they don't rot, they don't deteriorate. We've authorized all of this money, these trillions of dollars, to be given to various banks to bail them out. We'd like to know where this money went. Would you tell us where this money went? Bernanke looked at him and blinked for a moment. He said, no.
It should now be clear to people that the entire global economy is now spiralling out of control. 2008 commenced the deafening screams of a dying system. Interest rates globally are now on their way to 0%, with negative interest rates being the next crazy experiment. This phenomenon is now past terminal proportions, and when it's over, what most people thought was wealth will have evaporated. What follows will be a new monetary system. Whether this new system is to our advantage or whether it becomes future horror and loss of our liberties, only time will tell. So it's too late to save their global financial system. But the truth is, we shouldn't want to anyway. Global debts and asset bubbles have now reached epic proportions, which has stifled creativity, innovation, and real entrepreneurship. We are now living in a twilight zone of financial engineering, beholden to the largely invisible powers of central banking, which my next guest says is a much greater force than governments alone. The real damage from central banking and fiat currency are often undetectable by most people, but include things like increasing inequality, out of control living costs, increases in divorce rates, violence, drug use, homicide, and most of all, wars. Our world of nations is slowly grinding to a halt, and it's been done deliberately. But few people know that the horrors of today's global banking system all trace back to one cold night at 10 p.m. in November 1910 at the New Jersey railway station, where 6 men representing 1/4 of the total wealth of the entire world boarded the last carriage on an 800-mile journey to a place known as Jekyll Island. 4 of these men were under strict instructions to use their first names only. The other 2 men used fictitious names for added security so as not to be noticed. If any of these men were to be recognised or questioned, the purpose of their journey was for the simple pleasures of duck hunting. How lovely. Shotguns in carry bags were also used as props for added realism. It seems that the secrecy of that night was not intended as being part of a giant step forward for mankind. Instead, the events of that cold winter's evening and the 9 days that followed are the hallmarks of a classic conspiracy, which has been meticulously documented by my next guest, author of the book The Creature from Jekyll Island, G. Edward Griffin. Welcome to Project Civilization.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
Starting off, Ed, I first listened to your book in audio form back in 2014 when I was on a 3-day hike through Wilson's Prom in Victoria. Now, for anyone who knows me, I hate snakes. They absolutely terrify me, but when I came across one on the track, it barely bothered me compared to what I was listening to at the time. I was previously aware of some of the atrocities of fiat currency and double entry bookkeeping, but I didn't have the historical context as to how they all came about. Now, when I speak to people about our monetary system, most of them have little to no concern about how it actually works. Most people I speak with usually earn 6 figures. So Ed, why should people who earn significant wealth or even people who have no wealth be concerned with how our banking system actually works?
Well, that's a good question, and it's amazing to me that it is an unanswered question in many cases. Although when I put myself back at the beginning of my learning curve on this project, I probably would have shared the same incredulity about the importance of understanding a banking system. I mean, who needs to know about something that technical would have been my response at that time. But the truth is, we're talking about a lot more than just a banking system or a money system. We're talking about an ebb and flow of credits and debits. We're talking about the purchasing power of every human being on the planet. We're talking about every sale and purchase that takes place, every transaction, monetary transaction, all of human activity, somewhere along the line, or most of it anyway, almost all of it, requires the exchange of money. It's the other half of the transaction. No matter what you want, there's some kind of a quid quo pro. There's something exchanged, and usually it's of monetary value or can be converted into money. So it stands to reason that if it were possible for an individual or a group of individuals, a small group of individuals, to have their hands on that flow of ebb and flow of the money from here to there on every human transaction in the world, and they were able to skim off just a little piece of it. Just think of the tremendous capacity for wealth that would bestow upon those individuals who had their hand in the pipeline, so to speak. Now that is just the sort of the introduction to this, because it's not just a question of skimming off a little piece of every human transaction that takes place in the world and sending it to this small group of people who control the money system, but it's actually the ability to create the money in the first place. Most people, and myself included, as I say, years ago, never questioned how money came into being. We just sort of assumed it was there, and however it came into being, it was fair. Somebody was in charge of it. Somebody was looking out for our best interests and the people's best interests, and there were, everybody's watching each other, so it was all fair. I never questioned that there might be some kind of a criminal activity involved here. But what if, in addition to being able to skim off a little piece of every transaction in the world, every day, every hour, every minute, and every second, trillions and hundreds of trillions and many trillions of transactions, and you get a little piece of that. In addition to that, you're able to literally create this money supply out of nothing. Worse than that, what if you were able to create it out of debt? In other words, now we're talking about how the banks actually create money. It's an important issue. How does money come into being? You see, most of it, 99.999% of it, comes into being at the point that it is loaned into existence. It doesn't exist anywhere until somebody goes to a bank and says, I want to borrow $1 or $1,000 or $1 million. That money literally does not exist until the bank loans it to the borrower. Now it's money. Now think about that. So now the banks, in addition to having a piece of the action, are able to create an interest charge on nothing. They're able to loan nothing and collect interest on it. Now, I'm just giving you a peek into some of the depth and the amazing mystery that surrounds money that I think should arouse curiosity and cause people to ask more questions about how does this money system really work? I wonder if I am being taken advantage of, if it's in my best interest, or maybe I am being plundered a little bit around the edges. Well, it turns out that the people of the world who have not questioned and certainly do not have control over their own banking systems are, in my view, being literally plundered, legally plundered by a banking system that creates money out of nothing, collects interest on it, and has their hands to skim off a piece of every transaction created between all humans around the world.
Now, I want to go back to where I left off with the story of the train ride to Jekyll Island in 1910. This was where the groundwork began, an inception for what eventually became the current Federal Reserve Act, which came into place in 1913. Now, the current Federal Reserve Act was in fact the fourth attempt at central banking in the United States. and the previous ones didn't go too well. So Ed, can you give our audience a quick history lesson about the previous 3 failed attempts and why the train ride to Jekyll Island was so secretive?
Well, yes, and that requires some very interesting history. First of all, we have to understand what the Federal Reserve System is. We call it a central bank. That's the code name that is given to this creature. And the Federal Reserve is just one of them. There are a lot of these creatures around the world. Literally every large nation in the world has its own central bank. So we need to understand what that word means. It's not really a bank. And that should come as no surprise, because a lot of things that we talk about in our everyday life do not really mean what the words suggest. And this is one of them. The Federal Reserve, for example, is no more federal than Federal Express, which is one of our delivery systems. They deliver packages and sometimes some mail. They call it Federal Express, and it's not federal at all. It's a private company. So the Federal Reserve System is not any more federal than Federal Express, and it has literally no significant reserves. They call it the Federal Reserve Bank, and it's not a bank. So on the first 3 words, you see you've got deception involved. So what is this thing, this Federal Reserve System, or the other central banks around the world? Well, a central bank, once you analyze it, is nothing more than a partnership between the government and the banks, the dominant banks within the nation that the government rules over. And those banks form together into an association, they like to call it, a group of banks. It's literally a cartel. It's not a government agency, certainly not in the United States, like most people think. The Federal Reserve and none of the others are really federal or government agencies, although the earmarks of them. If you dig deeply enough, you'll find that they're independent of the government, and that's the way they're designed to be. And they sell that to the people as being an advantage, supposedly. So it rises above the passions of politics. They like to think that the bankers are more reliable and less subject to criminal activity and fraud and that sort of thing than politicians are, which is a very debatable assumption. But anyway, the national banks are literally banking cartels. They're no different than a banana cartel or an oil cartel. Peanut cartel happens to be a banking cartel. And so you have this cartel of banks. They form a partnership with their political buddies in the government. So we have the political scientists in the partnership on the one side, and the monetary scientists, who are the bankers, on the other side. And they create this structure, and they call it a central bank. And then the government gives that central bank the authority and the power to issue the nation's money. That's exactly what happens in the United States. It will come as a shock to many people in our country here in the U.S. to know that their government does not issue their money, even though it says United States across the top of it, and it has pictures of all of the great national heroes and historical figures of the United States. You know, they got Washington on there, and Hamilton and Jackson and Jefferson and all of these figures, and it looks like American money, but it's not. It's American bank money. It's issued by the cartel called the Federal Reserve System. So that's the first thing to understand about what this thing is a central bank. It's a creature. It's a kind of a hybrid. It's half private, it's half government. It's unique, and it's designed to do its specific job of controlling the economy and the issuance of money in that particular nation. And when I want to emphasize that since it is a private system, although it does have features of being under public control because it is created by politicians, nevertheless, it is essentially a cartel of banks made legal by their partners in government. And cartels have only one real objective, and that is to promote the objectives of the members of the cartel, nothing more. Cartels are not interested in the welfare of the nation or the people or unemployment or prices or inflation or anything else. They're interested primarily in the benefit to the members of the cartel, period. Now, in order to get away with this, they have to pretend as though they're very public spirited. They have to pretend as though they care a lot about the nation and about the people. And so the heads of these central banks are usually found giving speeches and giving testimony before government agencies and talking a lot about, well, we must do something to control inflation, or we would like to stimulate the economy, or we want to help provide jobs. All of these things, they have to go through all of that litany in order to make it sound like they're really interested in the nation or the people. But remember always, when you're analyzing these issues, these creatures are cartels. And like all cartels, their primary interest is the benefit of the members of the cartel. Now, having set the groundwork for that, we go to some interesting history. It's always been that way. And in the United States in particular, you see, we had one of those in existence right at the time the Constitution was drafted. And it didn't last very long, but we had a central bank in place. And it didn't last very long because it did what all central banks do. Central banks have the ability to create money out of nothing. So what do central banks do? They create money out of nothing. And it's always the case that when you have the power to create money out of nothing, and money gives you political power and economic power, you create more of it and more of it and more of it until finally you're flooding the economy, flooding the nation with this newly created money. Who wouldn't create money if they had the ability to do so and no limits upon it? And so that's what central banks do. They keep flooding the country with more and more and more money. And that causes inflation. It causes prices to go up, seemingly to go up. Actually, prices don't go up. It's just that the value of the money goes down. And it causes all kinds of havoc in the economy. And so in all cases, where people are aware, at least, of what a central bank is, they soon become very disenchanted with them. And that's what happened with the first bank of the United States, when it was, as I said, was in existence at the time the nation was formed. Well, it didn't take very long before the people demanded that that be abolished, and it was. And then a little bit later came along another a wave of pressure, political pressure from the banks. They wanted to create another central bank, and they did. And that ruined the purchasing power of the dollar, and the people got rid of that as well. And then a third one came along. You see, this comes in ripples, and it takes us back to the presidency of Andrew Jackson. Now, during that presidency, Jackson took it upon himself to become public enemy number one of the central bank of the United States at that time. And he laid his whole political career on the line. He said to the bankers, and he did this publicly in speeches, he said, "You are a den of vipers, and by God's grace I shall cast thee out." You know, almost like with the zeal of a preacher. And that was his political position, and he did cast the vipers out one more time. And there was a great war between the bank and between Andrew Jackson, and Andrew Jackson won that one. And so the central bank was slain again, one more time in America, until finally 1910 comes along and the bankers get together again. They say, well, it's going to try it again, because this is a very profitable thing for a cartel to do. So in 1910, they got together, heads of the biggest banks in America. They went to Jekyll Island, which was a private island, as you mentioned in the introduction, privately owned by the small group of bankers from Wall Street and their industrial friends, like, J.P. Morgan was one of them, of course, and William Rockefeller, and some of the wealthiest tycoons in America who lived in New York, all had resort they called them cottages, but they were beautiful mansions on Jekyll Island off the coast of Georgia. And they had a beautiful clubhouse there too. And so that is the place they chose for the cartel leaders to go, where they could consult in private, away from the prying eyes of the press. Is why they denied that there was such a meeting taking place. For a long time afterwards, they said, oh, that's nonsense. That's just conspiracy theory stuff. You know, we never went to a meeting like that. Later on, when the American people began to think of the Federal Reserve as some kind of a wonderful American institution, and they began to revere it, only then did these people begin to speak openly and say, yes, there was a meeting. Yes, I attended that meeting. And yes, it seemed like they began to compete a little while to see who could claim the credit for being the most influential person at the meeting. That all came afterwards, many years later. So anybody today can go to a well-stocked library, and with a little nosing around, you can find books and magazine articles written by the people who attended this meeting on Jekyll Island. And you can find out exactly what they were doing there and why they went, what they hoped to accomplish. And they made it very clear that they wanted to create a cartel control over the banking and the money system of the United States, and then to take their cartel agreement, take it to Congress and call it the Federal Reserve Act. And those idiots in Congress voted it into law. And so now here we are many years later. We're living under a law that really is a banking cartel agreement. But because it has the force and effect of law, and because if we violate that agreement, we go to prison, it seems like this is a government agency. Only governments can put you in prison, right? Wrong. Cartels can do it too if you have partners in government who give you the authority to act on behalf of the government. And now we have the explanation of why these cartels actually always seek partnership with politicians. So that, in a nutshell, is what happened. Banking cartels never give up. And if they are in power and get thrown out, they'll just wait a few years, maybe a generation, and they'll be back. Because by controlling the nation's money supply and the banking system completely, it is a means of acquiring total control over the nation itself. Who controls the money controls everything.
So can you tell us how the banking cartel actually pulled off the events immediately before the lead up to the Federal Reserve Act, which was passed into law just days before Christmas Day?
Well, these people who created the Federal Reserve System were geniuses. Were very brilliant people. And they understood that they were dealing with a process that not only had technical requirements, but had political and psychological requirements as well. And by psychological, I mean they had to sell their scheme to the American people. They had to make it sound as though it was in the best interests of the people themselves, so that no one would object to it. In fact, they would even applaud that it was being enacted into law. Make it sound really good. And so they crafted their promotion of the Federal Reserve System to satisfy those requirements. So they got all the politicians on board, and they made it profitable to them to participate. You can be sure that the politicians who supported this program were generously supported from the banking system with campaign contributions, gave them an advantage over their opponents in the political arena. So they took care of the political side, and then they had to take care of the psychological side as well. And it's an interesting thing, it was to me, as I discovered in researching all of this years ago, that some of these very people who promoted the Federal Reserve Act and knew exactly what they were creating and were doing everything they could to get it passed through Congress, once they had the legislation in place and it was being debated, they started making public pronouncements as though they were opposed to the bill. They said, you know, this bill is bad for business. It's going to be bad for America. And these are the people who promoted the bill and drafted the bill, actually, and they're talking it down. But they're doing so publicly so that the press will report that they are the ones opposing the bill. So the average Joe looks at this, I can see it now. Here's a couple sitting over a cup of coffee in the morning, reading in the newspaper, and the guy says to his wife, Maud, listen to this. These bankers don't like the Federal Reserve bill very much. It must be pretty good. This is the kind of psychology that was used. And some of these banks actually financed the creation of ad hoc committees, as they're called, special committees that were springing up all over the country in every community, usually headed by some academic, some professor at some local university, or some businessman, and it would be, let's just call it the Cincinnati Committee for Honest Money, and it would have the names of some very qualified person on the letterhead, and he would be the chairman or the president of this committee, and they would issue pamphlets and letters to the editor of the newspapers and say, we support the Federal Reserve Act because it's good for America, da-da-da-da. And little did they know, actually, these committees really didn't exist. They were just usually one person or two people, and these people were directly or indirectly in the employment of the banks themselves, you see. But they created this impression all around the country that there was a movement, a popular movement, especially an intellectual movement, and people who really understood what was going on. So they created this false impression. And of course, they made grants, rather sizable financial grants to universities. All universities, even today, but especially in that day, they're all hungry for more money. They needed money. And so $1 million donation from a major bank was a very welcome thing, and the donations came, but they always had a string attached to them. The string was, well, we'll give you this money because we think that you need a department of economics, or you need to improve your department of economics. And so that's what our money is for. And you wouldn't mind, would you, if we suggested the name of an appropriate person to be the head of your department of economics? And of course, the president and the board of directors at the university are looking at $1 million check, and they say, oh, well, no, who do you want? Who do you want as the chairman of this division? And so the banks got their people as the chairman of all the economics departments of some of the greatest universities. And those guys, of course, were bought like hamburger by the pound. And they started to write these academic papers praising the Federal Reserve Act and how it would greatly improve America. And so the average public is completely, or was completely unaware of all of this background manipulation at the psychological level. And so when they came across this stuff, they were completely unprepared to recognize it for what it was. And this, I could go on, but I think you understand just that little summary, that the people who promoted the Federal Reserve Act were brilliant strategists. They understood psychology, they understood politics, and they understood money very well.
Now, you've said in your book that the financial crises of 1873, 1884, 1893 and 1907 were as a result of specific banks being weak rather than the actual banking system being weak. Can you explain this? Because obviously there was a lot of background in the Act itself saying that it had to be enforced or enacted into law because the banking system was weak.
Well, I'd have to go back and see the exact quotation to which you're referring, because it doesn't sound like that is the way I might have phrased it. But anyway, I'll address the issue as I see it. Prior to the Federal Reserve System, there really was no banking system in America, at least not a national system. So in that sense, we can't put the blame on all these failures on the banking system because there was none. Each state had its own system, and there were weaknesses within those separate state systems, and they were all essentially the same problems that we're having in the Federal Reserve System. Each state authorized a central bank within the state, It's just the way things have always been done in modern history, and I include that as modern history. So we never really did have a major era of honest, laissez-faire banking, ever. A few little pockets, in history that didn't last very long. There was one in Scotland, and for a couple of years in England we thought we had honest banking, but it didn't. None of that lasted very long because the bankers didn't want that, and politicians don't want it either. Both sides want control the economy and money because that gives them great power of all kinds. It just gives them the power that they seek, and so honest banking never has existed very long or very broadly in the world. It's always been a system in which the banks receive special privileges from the political system. They go to the politicians and they say, we want permission to do this, this, and this. And in return, we will allow you to control us, or the other way around, actually. Sometimes the banks come to the government, the politicians come to the banks and say, look, there's a lot of political pressure here for controls over you guys. You guys are not liked very well, and our voters want us to monitor you and control you and make sure you're on the up and up. And the banks say, oh, sure, you can control us. Of course, we like that idea, but here are the controls. We'll write out the rules, and we'll make it sound like it's controlling us, but in fact, it's a cartel agreement. And we're back to that again. So it's always been a partnership. And that is what we saw in all of the states in the United States prior to the Federal Reserve. Each state had its own little cartel, its own little central bank, its own little gimmick, where, for example, banks were given the right to not keep their contracts, their promises. No other business ever had legal release from keeping its contract, but the banks do. The banks did, and they always have. They say we'll issue a bank account to a person who makes a deposit, and we promise that person that we will return their money in gold or silver. In those days, they said we'll accept your gold and silver, and we'll hold it on deposit, and we'll return it to you at any time you demand it. That's called a demand deposit. And what happened, of course, is that they immediately loaned that gold and silver out, and they created more IOUs based upon it, and they could never return all of that gold and silver if everybody asked for it at the same time. And everyone knew that they couldn't do it. It was a lie. It was a practice in banking that you only hold a reserve, a fractional reserve of what your obligations are. If you have, let's say, $1,000 in your vault, the banks are allowed to loan, let's say, $10,000 or more on that $1,000 in the vault. So you only have a fractional reserve. And if people take that money that's been loaned out and they put it into a bank account and they say, now that's my deposit, I borrowed it, of course, but now I deposited it somewhere, and the bank says, okay, it's a demand deposit, and they all say, I want my money back, the bank can't do it. They can't give them the gold and silver. And that was made legally acceptable in return for supposedly being regulated by the governments. You see how that works? If you want to commit a crime, you get the government involved to regulate you, and in those regulations, they say that it's okay for you to commit the crime. That's how it works. That's especially true in the field of banking and in a lot of other fields as well. And so what we had then in America and all around the world prior to the Federal Reserve System was a series of these little fraudulent banking systems. And that's why I say there was no system, singular, in America. There were many of them. And so in that sense, I would agree with the statement that you made earlier, that it was not a failure of the system. It was a failure of weak banks. And by weak banks, I'm talking about banks who overextended. They created too much money. Of course, they shouldn't create any money, really, out of nothing without disclosing it and without making it clear to borrowers who are borrowing this money that there's really nothing there behind it. But they don't do that. They just keep quiet on that, and they just want you to believe that all money is the same. And of course, they don't want it to be backed by anything anymore. So anyway, back to your question. Prior to the Federal Reserve, we had a lot of failing banks because they were extending their exposure, their obligations too far. They just went too far. You can play that game up to a point because not everybody wants all their money at the same time. So if only 20% of the people want their money, you can afford to expand your obligations on top of your deposits by a ratio of 5 to 1, and nobody will know the difference. So you can collect interest on $4 that you don't even have if you can create 4 based upon the 1. So that's the game that has always been played, but these banks never stop it at what is realistically feasible. If you can do 4 to 1, well, why not 5 to 1? And 5 to 1, how about 7 to 1? How about 10 to 1? How about 20 to 1? And finally, as it is today, there's no limit whatsoever of the ratio. So these banks had extended themselves in that fashion universally, and there were people who finally said, hey, this doesn't sound right. I want my money back. I want my gold. I want my silver back. And the banks didn't have it. And so they had to close their doors, and they had to admit that they were operating in a fraudulent manner, and they were bankrupt. And then that caused the runs on the bank, is when the gum-chewing public finally figured out what they should have known all along by studying the system. But they finally figured it out because they saw the lines there in front of the bank and said, oh, wait a minute, maybe I better get in that line too because I've got money in that bank. And what if they don't give it to me if I need it? And so those were the runs on the bank, and they had to close the doors of the bank, and the banks went out of business, and those were called bank failures. Well, all the banks were failed, except that most people never knew it. There were little propped up corpses that were continued to run business. And so all of the states were having this problem of failed banks, and failed banks. So now along comes the Federal Reserve System in 1913. It says, we'll solve this problem. And how are they going to solve it? They're not going to solve it by causing the banks to actually keep the deposits on hand that they promise, or to do honest banking, and to keep their contracts. No, that wasn't their solution. They said, look, let's all get together. And so if we have a run on the bank over here on the east side, we'll just take the money from the west side and run it over there and take care of the run on the bank there. So if Michigan has a problem, well, maybe Pennsylvania will have the money. And if Pennsylvania has a problem, we'll go down to Texas and get the money. We'll move it around. So they didn't really solve the problem. They just sort of kicked the can down the road and made it a bigger problem and got by with it for a long time. But now we see how big the problem really is. And instead of just individual banks or individual states coming apart at the axle, the whole bloody system is coming apart, which was a predictable event long ago if you understood how the system worked.
Banking bailouts, they began in the 1980s with Lockheed Martin. So is this going to be the new norm in the future?
Well, bailouts of the banks, that's an interesting phenomenon. And we're back to the issue I mentioned a moment ago, that banks have a very special arrangement with governments. They have privileges that no other businesses have. I can't think of many businesses out there that, certainly not my business, if I have a business failure, I can't go to the government and say, bail me out, give me some money. I lost all my money, so give me some more money so I can start over again. But the banks can do that. It's sort of written into the charters of these central banks. That's one of the cartel rules, is they have this special relationship with government in return for the appearance of regulating the banks, supposedly on behalf of the people. The banks get these little goodies like being able to go to the public trough and get some money whenever they need them. And those are called bank bailouts. So what happens when the banks have made bad loans and they make bad business decisions, like any other business? If you make bad business decisions, your business goes belly up. And so the banks always get to that point because they make bad decisions all along, knowing that they'll never be held responsible for them. Like most businesses, if you lose money for very long, you have to go out of business, and then you get in the unemployment line and you're looking for another job and your business closes down. But not the banks. If you lose money and everything goes sour, you don't have to close your bank down. You just go to Congress and you say, well, we need to be bailed out. We need your help, because banks are very important. And if this venerable bank fails, it'll be bad for America. That would cause a great deal of unemployment. There would be hardship. The economic situation would worsen. We'd have a great economic crash. People would go hungry. Babies would not have milk. It goes on and on and on. They got all these things. It's a humanitarian thing to do, is to send money to the banks and bail them out. And that has been going on and on and on forevermore. But now we've come to this crossroad. We've had such horrendous bank bailouts starting in 2008, and it has received, surprisingly enough, it has received so much publicity in the press. The press normally doesn't talk about these things, and at least they don't talk about it in a way that people understand what's going on. But in this case, I'd like to think partly because of critics like myself and many others, say Congressman Ron Paul, making this a big issue when he was running for president of the United States. Because of a few loud voices like that, the public was getting the clear picture that, wait a minute, these banks are being bailed out, given money that's taken from the taxpayers. And that's not right. And people were, pushing back against this idea. And that process, I think, is continuing. People do not like the idea of having their purchasing power reduced in order to pay through inflation, to bail out the banks. And so now the banks have come to a crossroad. They certainly don't want to give up their ability to extract money from the citizenry to bail out their institutions when they make bad business decisions. They're not going to give that up, so they have to figure out a new way to steal the money from the people. If they can't get it through taxes or inflation, then what's left? Obviously, it's what they did for the first time, visibly at least, was in Cyprus a few years ago. It's called the bail-in, not the bailout, but the bail-in. Well, what's that all about? A bail-in is another deal where the banks get together with their buddies in the government and they work out something that is totally illegal, normally, totally unethical, work out a way to steal the money from the depositors, and the politicians say, okay, we approve, they put it into law, and now it is legalized theft, legalized plunder. That's how it always works. That's why the cartels have to have their partners in government, is to legalize their criminal acts. And so now, with a bail-in starting in Cyprus, it is possible and totally legal for the banks to say, we're short this month by $100 million or $100 billion. We're short, and if we don't get this money from somewhere, we're going to have to close our doors. Now, that's not going to happen. So they simply go to their depositors, and they look for all the big depositors at first, and then they just take whatever they need out of the accounts of their depositors. They might take 10%, 15%, 20%, 40%, whatever they need, and it's legal. That's called a bail-in. And that has now been officially endorsed by all the banking systems of the world. It was officially endorsed by the Federal Reserve System last year. And the next time a big crisis comes to the banking community, that is how they intend to steal most of the money from the citizenry to make their actions profitable once again.
Gosh, so now I want to move along to inspecting some of the more important institutions of the past 100 years. The IMF and the World Bank were born from the Bretton Woods Agreement in 1944, and their stated goals were to facilitate international trade and to stabilise exchange rates of national currencies. But your research shows that there are many hidden goals behind this institution. Can you explain?
Well, yes. back to my favorite theme, there's a difference between the stated goals and the real goals. I don't think those were ever the real goals of the people who met at Bretton Woods. They sounded good, didn't they? To stabilize the economies of the world, to stimulate commerce, and to improve the economies, and it was all for good. It was all for the people of the world. It sounded very good. But don't forget who these characters were. They're either career politicians or career bankers. Now, there were some academics there, of course. It's hard to categorize them, but they were academics. But I relate that whole story to what I was taught in school many moons ago in that one little course I took at the University of Michigan, where they taught us a little bit very little about the Federal Reserve System and the banking system and the economy. And it was said in the textbooks that the Federal Reserve System was created to stabilize the monetary system, stabilize the economy, to stimulate employment, and to fight inflation, and to stabilize the purchasing power of the American dollar. That was and it was then and still is the story, the official story of why the Federal Reserve System was created. Everybody takes it at face value. Why challenge it? That's what they say. Could it be anything else? Well, don't forget what I said a moment ago. Federal Reserve System is a cartel. And does it sound that that would be the objective, the primary objective of a banking cartel? And the answer is no. Now, it's true that they don't want to kill the goose that lays the golden egg. They don't want to destroy the economy. And they want to keep the economy as healthy as possible so they can plunder it. So they don't want to destroy it, but their objective is not to focus on the on the economy, but to how much they can get out of the economy. So when you look at the Federal Reserve System and ask the question, well, did they achieve any of those goals that they said was the purpose for its creation? Did they stabilize the economy? Did they fight inflation? Did they improve unemployment? Did they stabilize the purchasing power of the dollar? Did they do any of these things? And the answer is no. They failed miserably. They get a failing grade on every statement that they say was their objective for creating the Federal Reserve System. And you think, well, gee, are they stupid? They certainly have made some serious mistakes, haven't they? Well, there again, it's because you're buying into the myth. You're buying into the story that the Federal Reserve cares about these things. The Federal Reserve does not care about these things. The Federal Reserve System cares about the bottom line of the banking cartel, cares about the influence of the banks. It cares about control of the few over the many. Now, if you understand what the cartel really wants to do, and now you grade the Federal Reserve System on its achievement, it gets an A on all of those levels. It did all of those things, you see. So we're back to the Bretton Woods thing. If you believe that was the real purpose of the Bretton Woods Agreement, you have to say, well, it didn't accomplish those things very well, or at least not for very long. And look, it came apart. It flew apart. I think the purpose of the Bretton Woods Agreement was to lay the groundwork for what would eventually become an international banking cartel that controls the world and the economy of the world in very much the same way that the local banking systems of the national banks control their own countries today. They just are looking forward to an international system where it is all under one central authority and control. That was the purpose, in my view, for the Bretton Woods Agreement, but they had to take it in little baby steps along the way, and that was the beginning of the process. Now, we come after all these years, and we're seeing the end of that process looming, because now the talk is about merging all of these failing monetary systems into one new failing monetary system. It will fail because it's based on the same principles. In other words, the concept is exactly the same as when the Federal Reserve System said, we'll solve the problem of all these failing national banks at the state level. We'll put them all together, and that'll take care of it. We won't change any of their practices. We'll just put them all together, and that'll solve the problem. Well, it didn't. It just made it larger. And so now we're seeing that same and final step being offered to us. Now, the solution to all of these failing economies and all these failing monetary systems, we're being told, is to have the same people who created them now work together and create a brand new one, and it'll be international in scope. That has been the plan all along, and we're coming very close to its fruition right now.
Now, next is the Council of Foreign Relations, which is probably unknown to most people, but this is what Hillary Clinton once said about this organisation.
It's good to have an outpost of the council right here down the street from the State Department. We get a lot of advice from the council, so this will mean I won't have this far to go to be told what we should be doing and how we should think about the future.
Now, I personally believe Donald Trump will win the US election, but in case he doesn't, should people be worried about the CFR and Hillary Clinton?
Well, I think people should be very worried about the CFR regardless of who wins the election. The CFR, for the purpose of your listeners who may not be familiar with it, and probably not many are in your part of the world, the CFR, the Council on Foreign Relations, has been correctly referred to, in my view, as the hidden government of the United States. It's a private organization. It was founded by the Rockefellers. It's very powerful, very wealthy. It's small, relatively small in size. I think its total membership now is only about 4,000, maybe 4,300 people, something like that. But the question is, who are these people? If you look at the roster of the Council on Foreign Relations, you'll find that these are literally all of the movers and shakers in the field of politics, banking, and education in America. These are the people who call the shots. These are the presidents of the United States. These are the secretaries of state. These are the secretaries of defense. These are the heads of the CIA. These are the Supreme Court justices. These are the congressmen. These are the senators. These are the heads of the great communication centers, ABC, CBS, NBC, Turner Broadcasting, all of those. These are the management teams of the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, Life magazine, Time magazine, etc., Newsweek, etc. All the communication channels. These are the people who are in charge of the massive labor unions. These are the people who run America, and there are only about 4,000 of them, you see. It's a very powerful organization. It's not secret because it's out in the open. Its proceedings are pretty secret. They do have meetings that some of them are made public, but their whole purpose is to become a network, and they are the network of the people who run America. And they come together through the Council on Foreign Relations to determine what policies they should be pursuing. They have a very strict code of ideology, and that code can be summarized pretty well by saying it is the creation of world government based on the model of collectivism. Everything they do, everything they advocate, points in the creation of a world government based on the model of collectivism. Collectivism meaning all power in the state, with power from the top down, the people not controlling their own government, but serving their government, supposedly for their own good. That is the prevailing political ideology in most of the world today, and it certainly is the ideology that is held by these movers and shakers in the Council on Foreign Relations. So we should be very, very concerned about that organization, and we should know what positions they hold and what their goals are. Now, the reason I say it makes no difference who wins the election is because we can tell that even if Mr. Trump were to win, he would be surrounded by members of the Council on Foreign Relations. I can say that without any fear of contradiction. I know that I'll give you two reasons why I think I know that. Ronald Reagan was in a similar position years ago. He even spoke out in his campaign. He spoke out against the Council on Foreign Relations. He said, when I'm elected, I'll see that the power of this group is broken. But by the time he was in office, of course, he selected as his running mate George Bush, who was a leading member of the Council on Foreign Relations. And he surrounded himself in all of the important cabinet positions, and all of his appointments primarily were members of the Council on Foreign Relations. So there you have that example. And I see no reason that we could expect anything different today. Now, we also know that about 3 weeks ago, I believe it was, Mr. Trump went and requested an audience, I'll call it that, an interview, a private interview, with, I can't think of his name right now. He's Rockefeller's right-hand man, the former Secretary of State, Kissinger, Henry Kissinger. See how he's the top member, you might say, of the Council on Foreign Relations. And Mr. Trump went and asked for an interview with him and consulted with him privately. So the Council on Foreign Relations is a force not to be ignored. And we must not think that we can weaken its influence simply by voting for some guy that's going to be elected to the White House. One man in the White House cannot do anything if he's surrounded by people who are determined to implement a policy, even if he disapproves of the policy. They'll see to it that he is thwarted at every turn.
I totally agree, and I think it's actually how corporations work too. The CEO doesn't necessarily have as much control as people think if the organisation doesn't like him or her. Now, just moving to the World Trade Organization, 1994, you've said that this was the third pillar of the New World Order. Can you explain that?
I think that the World Trade Organization is merely another example of the implementation of the goal of the Council on Foreign Relations, which is the creation of world government based on the model of collectivism. The World Trade Organization is merely an extension of that concept. It is a way of creating that end goal. In other words, you can't just build world government based on the model of collectivism all in one fell swoop. It takes what we might call legislation. It takes rules, regulations, implementation of treaties, and that kind of thing. And it's all done brick by brick over a period of time. And the walls of collectivism just get higher and higher as time goes on. So the World Trade Organization was one very big brick in that wall. But it's merely part of the bigger process, and we have to understand that what the process is before we can understand what the organization is up to.
I was recently reading an Australian opinion piece by Ian Verenda titled "We've been sold out by the TPP sham." The opening sentence actually said, "The Trans-Pacific Partnership isn't about trade, and it's certainly not about free trade. It's about enriching the interests of major corporations at the expense of ordinary citizens." So Ed, what's all this about?
Well, I think what you just read is a perfect summary of what it's all about. It is an example of how collectivism, and certainly a world government based on the model of collectivism, opens itself beautifully to being controlled by private interests who have their financial resources, very large financial resources, either banking or corporations, and it's hard to separate those two. Once you have the concept in place that the government should be allowed to control the lives of the people in every way, control their activities, control their purchases, their education, their employment, their health care, home, everything, nutrition. Once you give power that kind of power to government, which is the hallmark of collectivism, then government becomes a magnet for all of the suede shoe con artists and all the members of the predator class, because they know that if they can just get into government, they'll be able to do all of the things that instinctively they want to do But if they were to do it in the real world without government, they would probably be thrown in prison. But if they can be in government, nobody's going to throw them in prison because they control the judicial system and the prisons. So this is a case where these corporations, we're kindly referring to them as these large corporations, are seeking special favors which will allow them to plunder the citizens. It's just another example where cartels, private cartels, seep their way into partnership with government, just like the Federal Reserve System did with banking. Now we've got all these other corporations wanting to do the same thing, and they're using the Trans-Pacific Partnership as a vehicle to do that. So they will be given special privileges and exemptions, and they will be able to legally plunder you and me and everybody else on the planet. It's as simple as that. And it's time that the people of the world woke up to this trick, and they better do it fast because time is running out before they'll have it all wrapped up.
Now, I want to briefly touch on the definition of money. As you well know, there's an argument that what we know as money isn't money at all. It's really just fiat currency. Fiat is, of course, the Latin word for let it be so. So the government just prints up pieces of paper or digital currencies through the banking system, and we are forced through law to accepting it as money. But if we look to history, lots of things have been money before, including rum, tally sticks, gold, silver, as well as countless failed experiments in paper money. History also shows us that people often operated through credit ledgers without even using money, similar to a barter system. Now, when I interviewed the legendary Jim Rogers, he said that we need to have a free market in money, which means that we need to have a multitude of things as a medium of exchange. Gold, silver and Bitcoin are examples of alternatives, but Jim also mentioned that there's been plenty of failures in gold standards before. I also interviewed Steve Keen recently, who's quite well renowned internationally for his views against the mainstream economics. Now, I have quite a lot of time for Steve, but he's fiercely against the gold standard and its inflexibility. Here's actually what he said. Do you believe in a gold standard, Steve, and should it be reintroduced?
No, I don't. No. Gold is regarding money as a commodity, and money has never been a commodity. What price you put on gold, you are not going to enable anybody to make more gold, okay? There's a physical limit. There's absolute fixed supply of gold on the planet. Imagining we could base trade on gold is nonsense. Gold is a speculative commodity that does well when conventional money systems break down.
If we had a gold standard now, though, would it work at all, or would the system currently work better, even though you don't like a gold standard? Would it currently work better now if we had one?
No, because again, what we have right now is a crisis caused by a shortage of money, okay? And there's the thing people most need to get is money, and money's the easiest thing to create. But it's not being created by the banking sector because it's created too much, and it's not being created by the governments because they have an obsession about surpluses.
So, Ed, are you for a gold standard, and do you believe that Steve Keen is wrong with his assessment of it?
Oh, there are so many things in that analysis that make me laugh. It just shows how much ignorance there is out there. And I say that advisedly. I don't like to call anybody ignorant, but I just say this gentleman is not he's not aware of what money really is or what the history of money teaches or anything like that. He's merely parroting the kind of garbage they teach at the university level to discredit a sound money system and make it and condition people to accept this fraudulent banking system that we now have. I don't know how to answer your question. There are many issues you brought up, but the one that intrigues me, I'll start with the very first thing, and maybe if I remember everything, I can work my way back through it, and if I forget something, please remind me. But you questioned initially you questioned there are many things used as money, and of course that's true, because money in its simplest definition is merely the medium of exchange. It's you exchange something for something else, not because you can use it. If you exchange one thing for another thing because you can use the thing you exchange it for, that's called barter. But if you exchange it for something as an intermediate, You can't use it except you're just going to hang on to it because you know that you can then swap it with somebody else for something you do want. It's an intermediate or a medium of exchange. Then that's money. And as you said, a lot of things have been used as money and still are today. Cigarettes are probably still used in the world today as a very effective form of money. In a lot of areas of the world where money is not fully developed, cigarettes might be the most secure form of money that you can think of in some parts of the world today. But the question is not what is money, but what is desirable money. And of course, different people have different views on that, depending on what they desire. Now, if you're a banker and you desire money to be flexible, as you mentioned a moment ago, which means that translates into you want the ability to create it out of nothing so that the quantity can be expanded as you wish without any limitations. They call that flexible money. It sounds better than just saying money out of nothing. Well, then, to you, desirable money would be the kind we have now today, fiat money, just created out of nothing. But if you're a consumer and you want money to hold its purchasing power over a long period of time, if you worked hard and you saved some money and you got $100 in the mattress, and 5 years later you pull it out, you want that $100 to buy pretty much the same thing that it bought or would have bought when you put it in. You don't want to. You want to pull it out 5 years later and find out it doesn't buy you not even a Coca-Cola out of the vending machine. So if you're a consumer, you want purchasing power to remain stable, and in order to do that, you can't have fiat money. It just doesn't. It doesn't your needs as a desirable money. You've got to have money that's backed by something of intrinsic value, something that takes human effort to produce. It doesn't have to be gold or silver, although historically that's always been the type of money that most societies have accepted over the centuries through trial and error. I mean, it could be, as I mentioned a moment ago, cigarettes. Cigarettes is perfectly good money, very good money. It has intrinsic value. It takes human effort to produce. And probably the cost of a package of cigarettes today, in terms of purchasing power, is pretty much today as it was probably 10, 20, 30, 50 years ago. It's a good form of money in holding its value, except to the point where one of the things that cigarettes are not good for is that they get consumed, or they can burn, or they can possibly rot, or they can get wet. And so that doesn't make it as desirable as gold and silver, for example, which is one of the reasons why gold and silver is generally preferred over cigarettes or cows or anything else that has some flaws in it. So it's just a question of what is desirable money. And now we come to your question, is gold or silver a desirable form of money? And then the subsidiary of that question is, should we have a gold standard in our monetary system? And these are somewhat, they're related questions, but they're not the same. So my answer to them in this order is that I think money backed by gold and or silver is excellent money. It is probably better than any other money that I can think of. And it's certainly historically proven itself to be the most desirable money for most people over the longest period of time in terms of its ability to preserve purchasing power and not be ruined by inflationary processes. Now, does that mean necessarily that the state has to issue it and require that all money be backed by gold or silver? In other words, should it be a gold standard? And the implication with that question is, should there be a law that requires this? I'm not really so hot on laws on things except to protect life, liberty, and property. Now, if you say that a law requiring all money to be backed by gold and silver is required to protect your property, you might convince me to say, okay, I approve of that law. But I would say, well, maybe we can protect property without forcing people to accept that money. If we had a free market in money, if we had other competing currencies out there. I think if we had a choice between Federal Reserve notes, which are totally fiat money, and gold-backed certificates that were truly backed by gold and silver, and maybe not guaranteed by the government, but backed by some bank or some corporation or some company or some individual who had a long track record of keeping his promise, who had a long record over maybe it's a company that's been in existence for 50 years or 100 years, and they've never failed once to deliver that gold or silver, no matter how much was asked of them to deliver. If they had this reputation, it would be better than any government has. So I would take the reputation of an individual who has this record of 100 years, or not for an individual, but say a company, had a reputation of 100 years of keeping their word. I would take that long over the reputation of a government, for example, that has a reputation of breaking every promise and guarantee it ever made. Mm-hmm. So you see, the point is that the law aspect of it is up for discussion. The point is, money should be backed by something of intrinsic value that takes human effort to produce in order to keep its purchasing power on an even keel with all other things that take human effort to produce. Once you remove that requirement of human effort to back something being used as money, then it's broken loose from any relationship to purchasing power. And that's where money falls apart through inflation. I believe that if we had our choice between money that was privately issued by a company or an institution that was backed by gold and silver, or that was gold and silver, and we had the freedom to accept it or reject it, or to take some other currency, let's say Bitcoin, for example. It was our choice. I am firmly convinced that through trial and error and human experience, it wouldn't take long for society to determine which one was the best one. And we wouldn't need government to come in under force of law and threat of punishment and imprisonment to tell us which decision to make. We would make it on our own, based on our own judgment and on the actual experience of that currency in the marketplace.
Just on Bitcoin, Ed, what do you think of Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies in general? If you could jump in a time machine and go forward 10 years, do you think they're going to play a major role?
Well, I like Bitcoin because it has a built-in limit, which means, you can't continually expand it based upon committee action or political action. It's like that joke that we used to see periodically. Congress would raise the debt ceiling.
Yeah.
What good is a debt ceiling if you can raise it? It's not a ceiling at all. But they go through this solemn thing. Oh well, the debt ceiling. We set it there because we're gonna preserve the economy, right? So we got the ceiling there. But the first time they need more money, well, they just raise the ceiling, and it's just a joke. And anyway, so I like Bitcoin because theoretically they cannot raise the ceiling of the quantity of Bitcoin that can be produced. So that part I like. But the part that we have to keep in mind is that there are other cryptocurrencies that are coming into play and that will come into play. And if the value of Bitcoin is getting too high and the people think, well, gee, it costs too much, it's too valuable, too expensive, then somebody will come along with a Bitcoin 2 and a Bitcoin 3 and a Bitcoin 4. And in response to the free market, I think that the quantity of even Bitcoins, or that category, cryptocurrency, that quantity will expand or contract depending pretty much on market pressures, which may be good, may be bad, I'm not sure. But that is one thing to keep your eye on because it's not an aspect of it that is often discussed. But the only weakness, or in my view, the serious weakness of the Bitcoin is that it has no intrinsic value and it takes no human effort to produce. So it does have the ability to, supposedly, to have a ceiling, but no human effort to produce. It is what you might call vaporware. What happens to it if the internet goes down? What happens to it if the electricity goes out and you can't get to your computer. And you say, I got all these bitcoins. And the guy that you want to buy a loaf of bread from says, well, I can't use vaporware. I want something that I can use, like I want some milk, or I want an apple, or I want some gold and silver as a medium of exchange for the next guy that has something I want. So I come back to the idea that history has always selected gold and silver through trial and error as the ideal form of money. And I seriously question, even with the arrival of cryptocurrency, I seriously question if we'll ever be able to improve upon that experience.
You might be right. One thing that freaks out most people when they connect the dots is that our money exists as debt. Can you explain this?
Well, yes, you can say money is created out of nothing, which is true, but it's even worse than that because it's really created out of debt. And the process is not complicated. It simply is this. The bank has no money, or very little, let's just say very little on deposit. And of course, we start off with what is money in the first place. But putting that aside, the bank has very little of it. But what they do have is the legal power to create it out of nothing and then loan it to you and me. Now, they create it out of nothing, meaning that they can just put ink marks on a ledger or tap the keys on a computer and send digital impulses into magnetic disks and so forth, and it comes out the other side as numbers, and we can spend those numbers because the guy at the other end says, oh yeah, I recognize those numbers, has a dollar sign in front of it, and so he accepts your numbers, and so he likes it, but it's still nothing, you see. It's only his willingness to accept it as a medium of exchange. So the cryptocurrency serves that purpose, but it has no intrinsic value. Like gold or silver, you can hold it, you can hide it, you can bury it, you can exchange it. You can do that, of course, with anything of intrinsic value. So I like that aspect of it a lot. I don't know if that answers your question, but I got off the track a little bit there.
That's okay. Yep, that's pretty good. Now, I just want to move on to where we are today. A few years ago, I completed a master's degree in entrepreneurship and innovation, but I really felt like I completed a history degree because entrepreneurship and innovation in Australia and America is effectively dead. I think this is because the productive role of banks is to loan money to businesses, which through entrepreneurship and innovation creates jobs, which drives demand. So in Australia, 97% of money created is by the banks, but over 3/4 of that money is going into consumption assets and things like housing bubbles. So as a result of this, 50% of the Australian economy, directly or indirectly, is connected to the housing bubble. Our manufacturing rate here is a mere 8%, which is around the same percentage of GDP as in the US. And what really saddens me is that we are now breeding a new generation of retards who think that economic prosperity comes from signing mortgage contracts or speculating or even service jobs, which have always been the underdog of an economy because they take up less of the value chain. What's your thoughts?
Well, that is my thought. I agree with you totally. Yeah, I think that these folks are in for a terrible and rude awakening when they realize that the only thing that really underpins affluence and a successful economy are things that have been manufactured or converted, resources that have been improved. In other words, food and minerals and lumber and coal and converted into homes and factories and automobiles and things that we need to support human life. And without those things, then the service industries are meaningless. And I mean, if you're hungry or you're dying of thirst, it doesn't make any difference what kind of services you perform if nobody can give you food or water. You don't want digits in a computer. You don't want money even. You want food and water, or you may need shelter and so forth. So it's always been, because of that, it's always been that those nations or those regions that are productive have always moved to the top of the food chain, because they have produced tangible things. And that's the reason for it. They have created wealth. They have created the foundation for prosperity. They're not just living off of it and redistributing it and riding the wave. They're creating it. And that's one of the things that concerns me so greatly about the United States, because there has been a conscious move to export all of that, to get out of it, to get it out of the United States. They pretty well have done that. And as everyone knows, that the U.S. now is primarily a service industry economy. And I believe that the only reason that hasn't come back to bite us badly is because for at least a little while longer, the rest of the world is still willing to accept our fiat dollars. And it's, the United States currency still is the world currency. And although it's getting very unpopular, and more people are becoming suspicious of it, and there's less and less demand for it, it still is the king in that. And so that means that we're able to export a lot of our problems, export our inflation, along with getting rid of these dollars to other countries who need them. Because as poor as the American dollar is performing, in other words, as much as it's losing its purchasing power, other currencies are doing even worse. And so it behooves other nations and other peoples and other nations to still take those dollars, because their own local currency is worse. And as long as that process continues, we can get, we find people who want our dollars as though they were really worth something, because they can exchange them for things that are of worth in their own local communities. But comes the day when other countries are not willing to accept our dollars anymore, and they say, well, look, no, there are other currencies that are more valuable than yours. Then all those dollars, those euro dollars as they call them, will come flooding back to the United States. They'll come back in the billions and trillions of them, because nobody has any use for them anymore. They'll come back here to the U.S. and they'll be bidding for buying up real estate and stocks and bonds and property and businesses, politicians, anything else that's for sale. The money comes back and it floods through the economy. It will. And at that point, all this inflation that we have been spared over these years will descend upon us incredibly, and it'll be the end of the line. So I'm very worried about that, and we have no productive capacity anymore to speak of to rebuild. So it's a very dark view of the near future, and it does concern me. It concerns me a lot. Other nations of the world are going through the same thing.
Yeah, that just reminds me, on a slightly different tack, I just wanted to remind people that the Australian banks also failed during the 2008 crisis, except nobody seems to have heard about it. They were in fact bailed out by the US Federal Reserve, but that wouldn't surprise you, Ed, would it? Because the Federal Reserve has been allowed to do this for a long time with the Monetary Act of 1930, which enables this creature to monetize foreign debt and dump it onto the US taxpayer. So how does that make you feel?
Well, it makes me feel mad, very angry that they are able to get away with it. It's, as I said many times, it's legalized plunder. It's as simple as that. And it makes me feel angry, not only that they're able to get away with it, but that so many of my fellow citizens, my fellow human beings everywhere in the world haven't yet caught on to this criminal activity. And they have to do it. We have to do it. We have to get rid of this yoke if we expect our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren to live in any kind of a world that we want them to live in.
So as you just articulated, the present day looks fairly bleak for the US and for most of the West. In your book, you said that today's reality is a blueprint for a report from Iron Mountain in the 1960s. Can you explain that?
Well, yes, that's an interesting book, of course. I did write a whole chapter based upon the thesis in the report from Iron Mountain. And without going into it in detail, it is a book that supposedly was leaked to an editor or publisher, that supposedly was written by a committee that was worked for a think tank of the United States government. And it starts off with the question how to preserve peace in our world. And the answer, well, first of all, let me say there's a great deal of controversy about who wrote it, after all. It begins to look like it really was not written by a committee paid for or assembled by the think tank. It likely was written by the editor, who said that he was given the manuscript. His name was Lewin. I've forgotten his first name, but I think anyway, his last name was Lewin. And regardless of who wrote it, it was brilliant. It was perhaps satire, but it was brilliant satire because it laid forth the whole blueprint of how the New World Order is manipulating people into accepting, willingly, enthusiastically accepting their gradual enslavement. And it is done in answer to the question, how do we preserve peace, in this so-called book, this so-called study. And the answer is that, well, what we have to do is, first of all, they define peace as maintaining stability, maintaining government stability. Now, what that really means is that, in other words, protecting governments against being overthrown by their people. It's a stable government is one that is able to do anything it wishes without fear of a rebellion. Now, if a government can be overthrown by rebellion, it's not a stable government. So once you read between the lines, you understand that what the book is about is how to protect totalitarian governments from being overthrown by rebellion of their dissatisfied citizens. And so with that as an understanding of where the book goes, they come to the answer, which is the best way to do that is to scare the wits out of the people through wars and terrorism and threats of all kinds. And therefore the people will fall behind their leaders in this great moment of crisis. That regardless of all the problems we have, all the shortages, all the challenges to our liberties, all the insults to our privacy, regardless of all that, we still stand behind our great leaders in this moment of crisis because we are facing this terrible, terrible opponent, an enemy of some kind. And that was the thesis of the book. And then it becomes a kind of a textbook of how do you do that? How do you unwind that kind of a scenario onto the unknowing population so they will fall in line and be grateful for their loss of liberty. That's the essence of the report from Iron Mountain, and regardless of who wrote it, they nailed it. That is exactly what is happening in the world today.
So just briefly, moving back to the US government, it took the US government 198 years to borrow the first $1 trillion. What's happened since?
Well, it's gone wild because there are no limits, remember? No limits to what these guys can create. Remember, in order to borrow the money, they have to create it. And it's not like the old days where if a government wanted to borrow money from its citizens, it has to go to the citizens and issue bonds and say, we promise to pay. And we promise to pay you, not only pay you back, but an interest rate. And the citizens had to go forth and say, well, that's a good deal, so we'll loan you the money. But they loaned them the money that already existed. There was money that people had in their savings accounts. And so the people loved their government, they supported the government. Usually there was a war going on or some kind of a crisis. The government needed this money, and so they issued a war bond or some kind of a bond, and patriotic citizens responded. Like my family did, and like I, as a young fellow, I did. We took out this bond to help the country, and so we got a little interest, but that was not the motive for doing it. But it was our money. The money existed. And there was no new money created at that time. Now, since the Federal Reserve System has gone into its final stages of runaway, they don't go to the people anymore with these bonds. People are not buying these bonds anymore, not very much. It used to be that foreign governments bought these bonds. They're not anymore. It used to be that corporations bought these bonds. They're not anymore. It used to be that big institutions insurance companies, and they used to buy these bonds. That they're not anymore. At least the rate is way down. So who's buying the bonds? The Federal Reserve System is buying the bonds. And what are they using for money to buy the bonds? It's the money they created out of nothing to buy the bonds, you see. That's how the system works. So there's no limit to what you can, to the amount of money that you can loan into existence if you control both sides of the transaction, which is what the Federal Reserve System and the federal government do. They control both sides, they create the debt, and they issue the money to back up that debt, and the cycle just keeps going around, and the bubble keeps getting bigger and bigger.
Yeah, no, in a free market, interest rates are a function of the availability of capital. If savings are low, interest rates go up to encourage people to save. If savings are high, interest rates are low due to the supply-demand of money. And as you can see on the screen, the savings rates in Australia and the US are actually in decline, and they're tiny at the macro level. So interest rates should be very high right now, but they're not. And why is that?
Well, because they don't have to be. As you said, that normally interest rates would go up in order to stimulate lending money. In other words, loans. If you want to borrow money and it's not readily available, you have to keep inching up your interest rate until finally somebody steps forth and says, okay, I'll loan you the money at that interest rate. So you're increasing the interest rates to stimulate the supply of money to be loaned to you. But if you don't care about public supply of money, if you can create the bloody stuff yourself, you don't care what the interest rate is. You can make it zero, and you still can get money loaned to you through the captive central bank. In our country, it's the Federal Reserve. So that's why free markets don't respond anymore the way the old rules say they should, is because they've been completely paralyzed. They're anesthetized by political controls and manipulation. The free market is dead.
Sad but true. Now, one thing which has been of interest to me lately is whether there is a difference in the degree of interest about serious issues like central banking and economics between the genders. In my personal experience, it's always been far easier to find men who are interested in these sorts of topics. So out of curiosity, I logged into my YouTube channel and found that 84% of the 52,000 people who are watching my videos were on male registered accounts. So this could just be a coincidence, but I looked over my phone and my Facebook accounts and found that of the just over 200 women I knew, 90% of them were either directly or indirectly employed by government. And by indirect, I mean a scientist who works for a company that is solely surviving on a government grant is also counted. So in your book, you actually talk about this. You've said that when people can vote for the transfer of wealth to themselves, the ballot box becomes the weapons by which the majority plunders the minority. And this is the point of no return, the point where the doomsday mechanism begins to accelerate until the system self-destructs. So, Ed, do you think this is all just a strange coincidence?
Good question. And to tell you the truth, I hadn't thought about that before. And your statistics are interesting. But I have a gut feeling that this is not really gender-based. Gender statistics may be distributed along gender lines because of their relationship to the cash flow from the collectivist system, but I don't think it's a question of gender intelligence or gender motive or gender appreciation of certain basic social factors. It's probably, as you are suggesting, a question of employment and exposure to the rhetoric that comes along with favoring the collectivist system. I have a feeling from my exposure with the ladies that come on board with our program that these gals are on top of it, and I think they put a lot of us guys to shame, because once they get hold of something, they won't let go of it, and they're really fierce fighters.
So if we look into the doomsday scenarios with governments metastasizing globally, you've said that historically this leads to war, which governments use to keep the structure of society intact. So can you elaborate on that a little further?
The role of war you're talking about, is that correct?
Yeah.
Yes, well, that's sort of what
Yeah.
I referred to a moment ago when we were talking about the report from Iron Mountain. War is the historically proven, hands-down winner of a tactic to keep people in line and subservient to their own government, no matter how onerous their government may be, no matter how miserable they may be in that system. As long as they can be presented with a horrible end coming from conquest by a brutal enemy through war, why then people are content, and nobody dares speak against their leaders, because they will be accused of being unpatriotic in this great moment of crisis, and they'll be called traitors. And who knows, they might even be executed, or certainly very, very unpopular in the system. So yeah, war has always been the method of choice to keep a totalitarian system in power and to keep the people content with what they have. Now, going back to report from Iron Mountain, they did discuss other things that might be as effective for today's world as war. And they raised the question that what would happen if we had a one world system and there were no longer any nations, no national governments, and therefore there were no possibilities of war as traditionally defined as between nations. How would we keep the peace? How would we keep the people, because there would always be peace, in other words. So how would we keep the people content and not rebel against a tyrannical government? That was the question that they raised, and they considered some possibilities, and they toyed with the idea of creating the impression that the planet was under attack from aliens, for example. They talked about the possibility of manufacturing that image that would be so believable that people would say, oh, the aliens are coming, so now we have to get behind our one world government and take our place in the galaxy. They discussed that as a possibility. They discussed all of these things, and they came up with their second choice in all this was to create the illusion, they said, or to create the perception that the environment was falling apart, and that through such things as global warming and global and climate change and pollution and those things, the climate the environment of the earth was falling apart, and there would be no future for our children, and therefore we have to unite as a world behind this unseen enemy, which is destruction of the environment. And then they said it's not important that this be true. It's only important that people believe it's true. And I thought that was a very profound passage and report from Iron Mountain. So you see, it's all there, and so they see the possibility of replacing the threat of war with the threat of loss of environmental stability, and making it sound horrendous, as though it'd be the end of the world. And if they can do that, they may have found something just as effective in controlling the people of the world as wars themselves.
Now, Ed, I don't know if you're a fan of guns in people's hands. I guess we'll find out in a minute. But in my opinion, firearms should be in the hands of citizens, and I'll explain why. If the objective of gun reform was really towards saving lives in the future, then it's easy to work out that more lives would be saved if firearms were permitted, because in history, most totalitarian governments disarm their population first. prior to committing atrocities or world wars. In the case of the US, their murder rate is about 5 people per 100,000. So it'd take about 3,000 years for the murder rate of World War II to come through in the annual rate of homicide in America. And I think that people need to realise that peace and prosperity are not guaranteed rights, and that includes peaceful governments. Each generation always faces new forces and events which may challenge peace, but it's a lot easier for governments to overreact or turn draconian if its citizens are unarmed, which is why I was really annoyed with a recent newspaper article in the Sunday Morning Herald, which was actually thanking our former Prime Minister John Howard for disarming the population in the Port Arthur massacre with the recent events that happened in Orlando. So what's your thought on that?
I agree that this whole gun issue is an atrocious issue and so far off the main point. It's very simple to me. First of all, in America we have a kind of a unique tradition because of a Second Amendment guaranteed right to have and bear arms. So, and most countries don't have that, and we do. But and it's an advantage, a strong advantage, because it's a starting point. But even Americans have forgotten why that was there. It was not put there to protect people against criminals. It was not put in the Constitution following the Revolutionary War to protect the people against burglars and robbers. It was so that the future of America would be able to defend itself against tyrannical government. That was the whole reason for the Second Amendment. People have forgotten that. In my view, it's still the whole reason for it, or the primary reason for it. Now, it certainly has a value also in the field of protecting yourself and your family against common criminals. That's secondary, but it's still important. And on that line, I came up with a little saying some time ago. People liked it a lot. It's this. It's that guns are dangerous. They're very dangerous. People can be hurt with guns. The only thing more dangerous than having guns is not having them. And that's it. When you need a gun, when somebody's coming in your window or whatever it is, or if you're in a nightclub in Orlando and somebody's shooting around, when you need a gun, it's pretty deadly not to have one. So it's like so many things. What you have to have for your security and your own benefit sometimes is dangerous. And you have to learn how to live with that danger and make sure that you control it.
Very true. We're getting towards the end, but I just wanted to move on to the subject of educating the masses. When your book originally came out, you looked like this. And I looked a bit different too, as you can see on the photo on the screen. So since your book has been released, do you think there's been meaningful progress?
Oh yes, very meaningful progress. Since 1994, the world is totally different, and especially with regard to the topic of the book, which is the Federal Reserve System, specifically, and Central General. Yes, when I wrote that book, there was very little awareness of, and certainly very little interest in, the Federal Reserve System here in America. I remember when we got that first printing, I think I printed up 8,000 copies and had it delivered to my home. And we were just opening up our little publishing company then. We decided to self-publish and get distribution that way. And when that truck pulled up and I saw that pallet full of books and we put it in the garage, I remember saying to my wife, Pat, oh my gosh, what have we done? There's a huge stack of books. Nobody wants to read a 600-page book about the Federal Reserve System. And it was pretty true, actually, at that time. But fortunately, over the from the beginning, there was a stronger interest than I had anticipated, and I think primarily because I didn't really approach the topic as a textbook on money and banking. It wasn't so much about the Federal Reserve System. as it was about a crime, legalized plunder, how an elite few are able to plunder the majority. It was the history of a crime, and I treated it that way, like a whodunit. I knew who did it, and I knew where the body was buried, and I knew where the skeleton was in the closet, and I tried to write it from that perspective because that's how I saw it, and still do. And I think that helped a lot in making the book become popular. So the bottom line is that back in 1994, there was very little public discussion or interest in the Federal Reserve, but today it's a major topic. I'm sure the banking crisis of 2008 had a lot to do with that. It wasn't the value of my book, but nevertheless, people are aware today of central banking. They're aware of this thing called the Federal Reserve. It's become a major topic in public debate now. Even in the presidential debates, which normally avoid that topic like the plague, every once in a while it comes up. So we've made a big progress. We got people on the streets saying, end the Fed, end the Fed. We never had that back in 1994. So things are happening. It's once you get this concept into the public mind, I think you've made the greatest and most important step. From that point forward, I think people will begin to discover some of the truths that we're talking about in this interview today. And once they get a grasp of the fact that this is legalized plunder, then certainly there will be changes made.
Now, just onto media. YouTube is obviously a great new innovation. 15 years ago, it didn't even exist, and now it's made mainstream media rather irrelevant. But when we look at the views of videos on subjects like this, if 100,000 views is achieved over 3 years, you're doing quite well. You would think that the global enslavement of humanity would catch on like a bushfire, but it doesn't. By comparison, I saw a video the other day by a girl who talks about why she doesn't wear a bra. I'll put it up on the screen now. So as you can see, she had just under 4 million views in 1 week. In another example, there's a YouTube channel known as Boyfriend versus Girlfriend, and they have just under 9 million YouTube subscribers and 2.6 billion views since 2009. And some of their content just makes jellyfish seem interesting. So Ed, maybe the solution to defeating the globalists is to get women on board and combine boobs with banking.
Well, I like your thinking. I don't think it's going to work. And you know, I certainly understand your perspective and the chagrin one would normally expect to get from looking at the comparison of these numbers. But don't be so discouraged by that. It's the way it always has been and the way it always will be. The past history has been determined not by the majority, but by a very small minority of people who have made the difference. History is written by the few, not the many. The many always go along and follow that really small minority that rises to the top and becomes the leaders in society. And it is a fact that today, as always, most people are not going to be interested in banking as much as they will be in boobs, you know? That's just the way it is. Take a look at what's on the television, what draws the biggest the crowd. But fortunately, most of those people are not going to make any history. They're going to follow history. They'll be like a twig on the surface of the stream as it goes downstream, but they're not going to determine the direction of the stream. They'll just follow it. We plan and we hope to be that minority, that 1%, 2%, 3%, that know about these things, that care about these things, and are willing to put forth the private energy that's required and to network with each other and to become influential in the power centers of society so that we can be the new minority that helps to redirect history for the future. So, to summarize that up, I'm not really so upset as you might think by the fact that popular programs on YouTube and on television get much more draw than we do on our Reality Zone channel, for example, on YouTube. But I do take great encouragement to watch the numbers on our channel grow to hundreds of thousands and eventually to 1 million, because those million are the minority, believe it or not, will change the future.
I think you're totally right. Now, my last question, Ed, you're now in your 80s. Do you think you'll get the chance to watch this new chapter of humanity unfold?
I am watching it unfold right now. It's been unfolding for as long as I can remember. I don't think the day will ever come when we talk about this thing called the New World Order. People sometimes send me emails that, well, when is the date? When will it be that the New World Order comes into being? And I don't think it'll ever be a date. There'll never be a morning we wake up and the headlines of the newspaper will say, today at noon, the New World Order is officially installed. It's been growing.
Yeah.
It's been growing bit by bit, brick by brick, throughout most of my adult life. I didn't even realize it at first. But when I look back on history, I realized that the first bricks were put in place a long time ago. And most of them began in the Wilson administration, believe it or not. But we weren't aware of them. So anyway, to answer your question, I am witnessing this, and so is everyone else right now. The question is, will we be able to change it? I believe we can. I think it has not gone so far that it cannot be reversed. Now, I'm not kidding myself. I know that progress in that direction has gone very, very far. And events could change suddenly, very much to our disliking. But nevertheless, we are also building a foundation, brick by brick, and tier by tier. And especially with the young folks coming into our movement, as we see growing now day by day, no matter what happens, no matter how bad it may seem, we have our foundation in place too. And I firmly believe that within the next generation or two, or three at the most, we will have built the most beautiful edifice of freedom and prosperity that the world has ever seen. And I feel very fortunate that I've had a part to play in the laying of those first bricks.
Fantastic. Well, that's a wrap up for this interview. I really do recommend people either go out and buy the Creature from Jekyll Island book or download it from audible.com. If there was only one book you could read in this lifetime, this one would be it. And I'll also add some of Ed's links to the description of this video. G. Edward Griffin, thank you for coming on today, and good luck with all of your endeavours.
Thank you for inviting me, and I've enjoyed talking with you.